There's something strange about being a veteran. People always assume you'll always be the first person cheering for the next war. And I don't even think people realize they're doing it. It's just kind of baked into how we think about it. Like the second tensions start popping off somewhere in the world, people immediately look at the closest veteran and they're like, hey man, we might have to send troops over there. And there's this unspoken expectation that you're just gonna light up, that you're gonna be like, hell yeah, brother, let's do it. Like it's Call of Duty, like it's a mission select screen, but for a lot of us, it's the exact opposite. And I think that surprises people. Because once you've seen war up close, once you've watched friends deploy, watched families say goodbye, watched people come home different than when they left, you don't think about it the same way anymore. You just don't. It stops being abstract. It stops being something you argue about online or see in headlines. And it becomes very, very real. And when it becomes real, you start asking a very different question. Not how fast can we get there, not how do we win, but why are we going at all? And that question sticks with you. Hey, and welcome back to the Average Joe Nerdcast. I'm Nate, your resident Average Joe, professional nerd, nostalgia archaeologist, and today we're stepping away from the usual stuff for just a minute. No zombies, no movie breakdowns, no nostalgia deep dives. This is Mainline Monday, and this one's just a little different. This one's coming from a pretty personal place. Because before I was sitting here behind a microphone talking about video games and nerd culture, I was serving during the global war on terror. And like a lot of veterans from that era, I've spent a lot of time over the years thinking about the wars we fought, why we fought them, what we were told, what we experienced, and what we learned after the fact. And I'll be honest with you, watching the conversation around Iran, it gives me pause. And I don't say that lightly, because to a lot of us, this shit feels very familiar, and not in a good way. It feels like something we have seen before, and when you get that feeling, you start paying attention. You see, there's something I think people don't really understand unless they've lived it. When you deploy, you don't go over there thinking you're a part of something questionable. You just don't. You go over there believing in the mission. You trust the people above you. You trust that the decisions being made make sense, because that's how it has to work. Like, think about it. If every single soldier had to personally verify the geopolitical reasoning behind a conflict before stepping on a plane, then nothing would ever happen. And that's not how the system works. So you have to trust. You have to believe. You go. And at the time, that feels right. That feels normal. It's only later, sometimes months, sometimes years, that the questions start creeping in. Quiet at first, and then louder and louder over time. When the 2003 invasion of Iraq kicked off, a lot of people believed in it. And that is very important for me to say. This wasn't some situation where everyone knew something was off from the jump. There were reasons given, there were justifications, there was a narrative, and people bought into it. Soldiers included. We went, we deployed, we carried out the mission, because that's what we were supposed to do. But over time, things started to shift. The mission started to change. What we were told at the beginning didn't always match what we were doing later. And when that kind of thing happens, it starts to mess with you. And not in an angry type of way, in a clarifying way. Like, wait a damn second, what are we actually doing over here? And those questions, They didn't come from just journalists. They didn't just come from politicians. They came from the people who were actually there. Because when you've lived it, war stops being an idea and it becomes something you always carry with you. You see, there's something about war that looks very different depending on where you're standing. And I don't say that as a criticism. It's just the reality. If you're watching it on TV, it's maps, it's headlines, it's breaking news alerts, it's analysts pointing at screens explaining strategy. If you're sitting in a government office somewhere, it's policy, it's geopolitics, it's decisions. But if you're the one getting on the plane, war looks very different. It looks like saying goodbye to your family and not knowing what you're coming back to, or if you're even coming back at all. And that's not something you really understand until you're in it. And one of the oldest patterns in human history is this: the people deciding wars are very rarely the ones fighting them. Young people carry the rifles, older people debate the strategy. And it's easy, and I mean easy, to talk about war like it's a scoreboard when you've never had to live inside of it. There's also a disconnect between civilians and veterans when it comes to war. And I want to be clear, that's not anyone's fault. If you've never experienced it, your only reference point is what you've seen in movies and news and in stories. But those things don't carry weight the same way lived experience does. Because war from the outside, it feels very abstract, while war from the inside, it feels devastatingly permanent. You know, there's a moment every single veteran remembers. For me, it was the airport. I remember hugging my family. I remember the goodbyes. I remember trying to keep it together. And then you turn around and you start walking towards your departure gate. And it's strange because that moment is crystal clear in my memory. But everything that came after it, it's all a blur. It's like there's this dividing line in my life. Behind you is everything familiar: your family, your home, your normal life. And ahead of you is complete uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that can change who you are. Because when you walk through that gate, you don't really know what your life is about to become. But what isn't a blur is what it did to the people I served with, my battle buddies. Some of them used to describe it in a way that has always stuck with me. They'd say things like, "I don't know, brother, there's something about the sand over there. It gets in you, and you can't ever get it out." And I saw that shit. I watched brothers and sisters try to numb the pain of what we experienced with alcohol or drugs. I watched guys who couldn't sleep anymore. I watched people who could never quite relax driving down a road again, always thinking maybe there's something waiting for them right around the corner. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend I was completely immune to it. I've had my struggles too: substance abuse, mental anguish, for longer than I'm proud to admit. And that's the part people don't see when they're cheering for war, because the war doesn't always stay overseas. Sometimes it comes back home with you. And you hear it a lot when things start heating up. We're defending our country. And don't get me wrong, sometimes that is absolutely true. I am not dismissing that. But sometimes it is worth asking just a follow-up question. What exactly are we defending it from? And I don't mean that in some edgy, anti-whatever kind of bullshit way. I mean that as a very real question. Because when you're the one being sent over there, that question matters a whole hell of a lot more than it does when you're just watching it on the news. Like, what is the actual threat? What's the objective? What does success even look like? Because when you're sending people halfway across the world, the mission should be absolutely clear. The reasons should be absolutely clear. And the cost should be understood. Not just by the people making the decisions, but by the people being asked to carry them out, to make the sacrifices. And I think this is where things can get just a little complicated. Because when you have multiple intelligence agencies, when you have allied nations all looking at the same exact situation and saying there's no immediate or imminent threat, that opens up a whole other set of questions about urgency, about justification, about whether the situation is being presented as something it might not fully be. And those aren't easy questions, but they are necessary ones, because confusion at the top becomes consequences on the ground. And I think this is where things get even more complicated. Because if you've been paying attention to what's going on right now, it's not exactly clear, is it? And I don't mean that in a conspiracy minded type of way. I just mean objectively. It's really hard to follow. One day you're hearing there are negotiations happening, and in that very same day you're hearing those negotiations might not even be real. One day there's talk of escalation. The next day there's a pause. And you're sitting there as just a regular person going, okay, so what's actually going on? And I remember feeling something similar back in 2007. Not at first, because at first everything felt very clear, very defined. But over time, it got very, very murky. The objectives shifted, the messaging changed, and you start realizing, man, this is a lot harder to understand than it was presented to be. And here's the part that sticks with me now. If it's hard for us, sitting at home, watching this unfold, to understand what's happening in real time, then how confident should we really be about jumping straight to conclusions about what needs to happen next? And I'm not saying that means anything specific. I'm not saying this is fake or this is that. What I'm saying is uncertainty should slow us down, not speed us up. Because when things are unclear, that's usually when the biggest decisions get made. And those decisions, they do not affect the people talking about them on television. They affect the people who get sent over there. And here's the part that I think gets lost in all of this. When we talk about war, we talk about strategy. We talk about the politics. We talk about alliances. We talk about what happens next. But we don't always talk about the cost, and not the real cost, because the real cost of war does not fit neatly into a headline. There was a strike early on in this conflict, a school in Manab, and reports coming out, multiple investigations, human rights groups, even internal reviews are pointing to the fact that it was likely hit by U.S. forces using outdated targeting intelligence. Over 100 children killed. Some reports are saying even more. Primarily children in classrooms. And when that first broke, there was confusion. There was conflicting statements. There were attempts to say maybe it was something else. Maybe someone else. But as more information came out, that picture started to change. And again, I'm not saying anyone woke up and said, let's hit a school. That is not what I am saying. But what I am saying is this. War doesn't require bad intentions to create terrible outcomes. Sometimes it just requires bad information, outdated intelligence, a wrong assumption, and suddenly you've got shit like that. And that's what people don't think about when they're cheering for war. They're thinking about strategy. They're thinking about strength. They're thinking about winning. They're not thinking about a classroom full of children my daughter's age. They're not thinking about the families that have to live with that forever. And it's not just over there. It never is. Because like I've said before, that stuff never just stays overseas. It always finds a way home with the people who were a part of it, with the people who saw it, with the people who have to carry it for the rest of their lives. And that right there, my friends, is the cost, not the talking points, not the headlines. That. And when you start looking at it through that lens, it becomes a whole hell of a lot harder to cheer for. And through all of this, I think this is the part that's hardest to explain unless you've lived it. Something changes in you after you've been through it, and it's not always obvious at first. At first, you come home, and you try to get back to normal. You try to pick up where you left off. You try to just move on. But over time, you start noticing little things. The way you react to situations. The way certain sounds or environments make you feel. The way your brain is always kind of scanning. The way your brain is always kind of scanning. And for a while, you don't even question it. You just think, this is just who I am now. But then something happens. You hear people talking about war again. You hear the same kind of language, the same kind of energy, the same kind of confidence, and it hits you different. Because now you've got something they don't. You've got the context. You've got the memory. You've got lived experience. And I remember thinking at one point, man, I used to sound just like that too. I used to talk about it just like that. Before I understood what it actually meant. Before I saw what it actually does to people. And that's not me judging anyone. I promise it's not. Because if you haven't lived it, then how could you know? How could you understand something like that from the outside? You can't. Not fully. But once you've lived it, you can't unsee it. You can't unknow it. You can't go back to thinking about war the way you did before. And I think that's why so many veterans end up in this place where we're not anti-war in some blanket absolute sense. We understand there are times where force is absolutely necessary. But we are extremely cautious because we've seen what happens when things aren't as clear as they're presented. We've seen what happens when the mission shifts, when the reasoning gets muddy, when the cost becomes something nobody really accounted for. And I think that's why this moment right now feels so heavy for a lot of us, because it feels so damn familiar. Not identical, but familiar enough to make you stop and go, hey, wait a minute, hold on. Please slow down. Let's make sure we actually understand what we're doing here. Because once you've been through it, you don't rush into that again. Not without asking questions. Not without thinking it through. Not without remembering what it actually costs. And listen, I'm not dumb. I don't expect everyone who hears this episode to agree with me. That's never been the point. But the point is just, before we ask people to go, we should at least be willing to ask why. War has a way of simplifying itself in conversation. It becomes flags, slogans, sound bites. But it's never been that simple. It's people. It's consequences. It's things that don't just end when the deployment does. So when I see people cheering for war, I can't help but think about that airport gate. I think about someone else's kid standing there, saying goodbye to their family. I think about the friends that I served right alongside with, the ones who carried it home with them. And the truth is, supporting the troops doesn't mean celebrating war. Sometimes the most pro-soldier thing that you can do is ask the question before we send them. Why? And I don't have all the answers. I just don't. But I do know this. Once you've seen the cost of war up close, You stop thinking about it like a headline, and you start thinking about it like human lives. And that right there, that's something worth being careful with. And that's it. I know this episode wasn't some massive deep dive or anything like that. No huge breakdown, no lore charts, no timeline graphs. But it felt like something that needed to be said. And sometimes that's what you're going to get from me. Just real thoughts from where I'm at. But before I get out of here, shout out time. Shout out to my player 2 for life. Thank you for always listening to me ramble through these ideas before they ever make it to a microphone. And shout out to everyone behind the scenes at the Average Joe Nerdcast who keeps this little train moving right along. You know exactly who you are. And shout out to each and every one of my fellow veterans out there who may or may not be listening. I see you. And to everyone else listening, if this episode made you think, if it made you pause for even just a second, then do me a favor. Follow the show, drop a rating if your platform allows it, and share this episode with someone you think might need to hear it. And if you want to keep the conversation going, then please come hang out with us in the Average Joe Nerdcast Facebook group. I'll drop the link to the group in the show notes, or you can head straight over to Facebook right now and in the search bar, just search Average Joe Nerdcast the lobby, and you will find the page. The lobby is always open. Until next time, stay gold, nerd bold, and maybe just ask a few more questions before we cheer for things we don't fully understand. I'll catch you on the next one.
Game over.